Welcome to Time Capsule. I'm Mark Kenny and this is Steve Stone. And today we're interviewing Jim Garman, the Portsmouth town historian, on Island Park. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Just to get started, can you tell us a little bit how Island Park came to be established?
Sure. The northern part of Portsmouth was set up with 3 different summer colonies at the turn of the last century. First of all, let me get them straight. The Hummocks was set up by the New York, New Haven, Hartford Railroad as a place for their people. Then Island Park began, that was in 1893. And around 1900, people began to set up cottages in what we call Island Park. And then after that came Common Fence Point, when they were able to get rid of the fisheries that were there for 100 years, the Narragansett oil and guano works. So people began to build houses up in the northern end of the town, and the geographic layout of the town was the stone bridge was around the turn of that century was the main route for people to get onto the island. The main route to come on from any angle. Stone Bridge was what we call the ruins of the Stone Bridge now. That one was built in begun to be built in 1907, finished in 1911, but it was about the 7th bridge across that area. The first one was right after the Revolutionary War, and so the big problem they had was, of course, the bridges were not of enough stability that they washed away. And they made them of wood, and they built them of wood. And what a lot of people don't know is that there's a significant rip current through the Secaucus River. It goes somewhere between 5 and 9 knots, and it's tidal. It's not a river, by the way. It's a tidal estuary. And so the actions of the tide took out the bridges. But when 1907 was built, it was more substantial. Keep in mind, there aren't any other bridges off the island. At the south end, there weren't any. There were a lot of ferries, but no bridges. Okay, so what happens then is during that period of the first decade of the 20th century, people got the idea about building cottages there because they already had them on the Hummocks and elsewhere. So summer cottages, and summer cottages was the main type of building that was built there. So an important invention that we have in the United States is in 1888 when the first trolley car was invented. And the first trolley car ran in Richmond, Virginia. And by 1889, the next year, they had trolleys in Newport. And so the trolleys in Newport came out the West Main Road, ended at the end of Newport, and then eventually the next few years they decided they would expand them. So there came to be 2 trolley lines on the island, one of which came out the West Main Road, went into the property at different places, and ended up the Mount Hope Bridge, which was built in 1929, but there were ferries there before too. So on the other side though, the East Main Road, the Newport and Fall River Street Railway was built, and so the trolley railroad came that way, and so some investors decided that might be a place to build an amusement park. And so the trolley company started the amusement park, and the ownership was taken over by a man by the name of Hyman Schwartz from Fall River. And later there was another owner, another family that owned it. Okay, so what happened was the first buildings were rides, amusement park rides, like a carousel, a shooting gallery. That was the first 2, and they were started in 1898. And so beyond that, it mushroomed tremendously as an amusement park, and covering the whole end of Island Park with a lot of cottages interspersed between it. Anyway, and it was mainly the line that came out obviously followed Park Avenue. At that time, by the way, and this is important for later, Island Park was an island. There was a stream at the foot of the hill on this end that went through there, and when it didn't have any bridges on it, that made Island Park an island. That's where the name comes from. Start with that.
Jim, what other types of amusements were available down there?
Well, the peak of the amusement park was roughly around 1910 to 1930. And during that time, and I spent time in amusement parks, pretty much the same kind of things. You would have kiddie rides, you would have shooting galleries, you would have all kinds of different things like that. Plus, most important in Island Park was the development of the dance hall and the shore dinner hall, which drew lots of people. I think it's important to understand that, first of all, the geographics of it. The beach at Island Park was probably twice as big as it is today. It went quite a ways south, and so, but washed out by various storms. So it was a large operation that they had there, again, run by the trolley company at first, but with other investors getting involved in it. And the, all sorts of games and so on where you could knock off the lead milk bottles, that were weighted. It really made it difficult to knock them over. And just, things like that, souvenir stands all over the place. And there are people around who collect those souvenirs. They're still around, some of them. But in 1905, they got a Loof carousel. Loof was a preeminent carousel builder. He has them all over New England. And the Loof carousel was built on the island, on north end of the island. And so that was the first building of the amusement park. Then eventually other rides and everything came, and the ownership of the park fell to a man from Fall River by the name of Hyman Schwartz. And he owned it in 1905 until about 1925, and we'll go on with that. So that was what it looked like. It was the center of the town in a lot of ways, because as most people know, the population of Portsmouth in 1900 was about 995. And so it was all farmland, and there was no center of the town. And so that became the center of the town out there. Food stands all along Island Park where you could get all kinds of food and everything, seafood and other stuff, hamburgers even. And so that was what it looked like in about 1915, 1918.
Jim, in talking to you earlier, you mentioned there was a lot of different forms of entertainment, like dance marathons. I think there was a beer hall, boating.
The two biggest buildings that were built there, and they are really impressive. They were big. One was a dance hall, and the other was a shore dinner hall. And at the shore dinner hall, you could get lobster dinners and clams and stuff like that. And it was big, and it was open to everyone. The dance hall, was a big operation, especially in the 20s, because a lot of big bands came to the dance hall from New York and played for a day or two, and attracted large numbers of people. Dancing was really big at that time, still is, I guess. And but that brought a lot of people to the park, the shore dinner hall and the dance hall. And at the dance hall, they got into something that was very popular nationwide at that point, and that was dance marathons. Dance marathons were dances where an orchestra would play, and they would play for 50 minutes, take a 10-minute break. But if the dancers were still on the floor, they had to stay on the floor. They could rest, but they had to stay on the floor. And then the music would resume, and they would keep going as long as they could. And eventually it got to the point where there was one couple left, and they got a prize. Some of those dance marathons in the 20s went on for 24 hours. It's amazing.
Wow. It's amazing. During Prohibition, could you describe what happened in Island Park?
Island Park during that time had, before Prohibition, which started in 1920, ended in 1933, before 1920, Island Park had a lot of bars, obviously. You can imagine the attraction for that. But when Prohibition went into effect, that produced problems, not only in Island Park, but in the United States. And the area of New England, in particular, was a center of a lot of illegal activity. And this area of the Sakonnet River was a really big part of that. A tremendous amount of illegal alcohol was brought in to the island up the Sakonnet River. What would happen, the procedure that they used was that the big ships had to stay, at first they had to stay outside the 3-mile limit. That we had a 3-mile limit that said anything within that 3 miles to the shore was under U.S. government supervision, i.e. the Coast Guard. Okay, so once Prohibition went into effect, they realized they had to do something about that. And what they did about that was to enlarge that 3-mile limit to a 12-mile limit. Nonetheless, many ships came from Canada, Central America, Europe even, loaded with alcoholic beverages. And the locals would take a small boat out and load it up and then race the Coast Guard back to shore. The thing about it was that the boats that the rum runners used were far better than the Coast Guard ships at first. There's a famous case of the Black Duck. The Black Duck was a rum runner which got caught by the Coast Guard, but the Black Duck had twin 300 horsepower engines, and it could go fast. The only problem was when you loaded it up with liquor and boxes and everything, that slowed it down a little bit. So the Black Duck was seized by the Coast Guard off in Newport Harbor, and 3 of the 4 members of the crew were killed by the Coast Guard at that point. But nonetheless, the Sakonnet River was a highway for alcoholic beverages coming into onto the island. And as far as Portsmouth is concerned, the entire Portsmouth Police Department at that point, again, 1923, 24, was 1 officer. Soon after that, the state police got involved. But the real control of alcoholic beverages in the 20s was done federally by the Internal Revenue Service. That's who, they had boats at first, and they and the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard was very ill prepared in terms of the ships that they had. They had a hard time keeping up with the rum runners. To go on a little bit more about Prohibition, there was one gentleman from Tiverton who was quite ingenious during the Prohibition period. And what he did was, first of all, to use an airplane that he flew from the Island Park Air Park. There was an air park over here, up where the dump later was built. And they would fly out to spot to see where the Coast Guard was and guide their small boats away from the Coast Guard. He later, the same guy later got another invention. He developed a towable submarine, a submersible ship that he would take out, load up with alcohol in bottles and so on. And if the Coast Guard came close to him, he could cut it loose and submerge it in the Sakonnet River. And then go back later on. It would be flagged somehow. He'd go back later on and pick it up, and therefore he avoided prosecution. There's a series of articles he wrote for the Providence Evening Bulletin after Prohibition in 1930. I think it was in 33 they started, and I think there's 26 articles he wrote about his experiences. Not only running rum, the title of it is I Ran Rum, not only running around, but when they finally did catch up with him and he got arrested, he was in the state penitentiary, and he sat down with the warden and some some state officials and had some drinks there. But anyway, so Prohibition was big in this area. And so what they would do is they would bring it in, offload it, obviously, and they had special locations where they would offload it, and bring it to Island Park and elsewhere, and they would sell it. They would sell it in what everybody knows were speakeasies, which was a separate door some way in a building, in a restaurant, say, where if you knew the code, well, you could get in and get a drink. So Prohibition was it's hard to say it this way. It was a big problem for the police in Island Park during this time. It wasn't a problem for the customers there. Mm. So Prohibition was a really important part of the amusement park days in Island Park. Eventually, obviously, it got under control. Eventually, in 1930, Prohibition was abandoned. And what happened? The Prohibition was established with an amendment to the Constitution. There was nothing in the Constitution said the government could prevent alcoholic beverages. So they amended the Constitution to put it in 1920. And in 1933, the only way to get rid of it from the Constitution was to pass another amendment, which simply said that the 18th Amendment no longer is valid. That was the 21st Amendment. So Prohibition ended, and it's not necessarily a great credit as a period, because obviously there's a lot of gangsters and things like that came out. We all know Al Capone and things like that all over the country. So Prohibition affected Island Park, sort of. Mm-hmm. It was there anyway.
Jim, we also understand there was a series of fires at Island Park.
Island Park often had fires, and again, it might one cottage or something would burn, and there's I've read the newspapers, and there are documentations of 3 buildings burned last night, things like that. I think the big problem there too is that the Portsmouth Fire Department was not created until, I believe it's 1933, after this period. So they had some volunteers who, and a fire truck. I have a picture of the fire truck. It was pretty primitive. But by the time they got from the station, which was across from where Clements Market is today, down here to Island Park, it really wouldn't be much good. And so there were numerous fires, and eventually, in the 1930s, it was the fires that really, the fires and the hurricane that really took the park out. Yeah, a lot of fires. One other thing, and let me mention this, is
sure.
the roller coaster. Island Park had a roller coaster. In fact, it had, 1.5, because they built it in 1925, and they had a lot of problems with it, and eventually it got beat up in a storm. And in 1927, they built a new one, which was called the Bullet. We have pictures of the Bullet that we'll show you later on. And it was big, and it just went to the edge of the water, and it was one of the largest, I think it was, the number was like the 3rd largest in New England. It was quite a large operation. And but the Bullet was very big. Other things you could do at Island Park, you could go swimming, obviously. You still can. You could rent boats, and somewhere in the 1920s or so, they ran a series of swimming races across the Secundit River to Tiverton, and so that was really a big operation. But the roller coasters were really important, and you could rent boats. You could obviously go swimming on your own. So it was just a matter of all kinds of activity that went on there. Yeah. Send the kids off to swim, and we'll go sit at the bar, or we'll go ride the roller coaster. Mm-hmm. Again, on a Sunday afternoon, and from the photographs that we have, everyone was all dressed up. As many as 2,000 people would come to Island Park for the summer, for the day, rather. And so it was really a big operation, and I think it's important to understand that we didn't have TV then. We didn't have well, we're getting radio. Radio started in 1919. But there wasn't a whole lot to do. And this became the whole center of the universe as far as the Aquatic Island was concerned. People came from all over. The biggest problem they had, and this is why mass transit was important, the biggest problem they had was the, parking. Once cars started. Before that, obviously people rode the trolleys or came anyway, horse and buggy, I suppose, before that.
Oh, it's interesting. What caused the demise of Island Park?
Well, let's talk about its growth first.
Okay, absolutely.
It really went on for a long time as the center of entertainment on Aquatic Island. Think about what Newport was like. The Navy was there, Thames Street was there. What else? Not much. So it really was, and it was close. You could you get on the trolley in Newport, and you could be at Island Park in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Trolleys were limited to 10 miles an hour. That was a problem that they had. And in some cases, the trolleys had to go inland because some of the hills, like Raytheon Hill, was too steep. And so they couldn't go up that. But people flocked to this. There wasn't anything else close. There were other amusement parks in the area. There was one in Bristol, for example, right across where the Mount Hope Bridge goes across today. There was one there. But the main activity really was social, things like that. Take the family and go to the park. And keep in mind that when you had rides in the park, a nickel, maybe 10 cents. I mean, it really was a reasonable thing. And probably, I haven't seen the cost, but things like shore dinner halls were really relatively inexpensive. Shore dinners were relatively inexpensive too. So there were, again, a lot of activity. And what's interesting about some of the photographs that you see is that there are cottages interspersed with these rides. And but the main family that took over from Schwartz later on, in 1925, Schwartz sold it to the Cashman family. And the Cashman family invested more money. They came from up north, and they invested a lot of money into it as well. And so the Cashman family had a big operation in it. And they had a huge house that was right across, well, right down at the bottom of the hill, where you go down into Island Park. And I have photographs of that. So Cashman's Park was the place to go. And that's the name it became associated with it in 1925 and through the end of it. But anyway, and well, I have another story to tell about that. So there were fires. There were storms. 1938 wasn't the only hurricane that hit. There were numerous storms that came up because, as we all know, the beach area of Island Park is totally exposed, and there's just nothing to protect water from coming up the river, and that was the problem later on. We'll talk about. So the park flourished. And even in the difficult times generated by stock market crash, things like that in 1929, people still came to the park. And the biggest problem the park dealt with was weather. And they didn't operate all that much on stormy days. People still came, though. But the weather was a big problem. And in fact, the weather was the reason why the Shore Dinner Hall went out of business, because I forget the year. It was around 1932 or 30. They only had 5 days, 55 days of good weather, and so that was very problematic for them, and didn't make enough money, obviously. So that was a problem, and I don't know. The rest of it was a summer resort. There was tons of people there. And I can imagine it. Think what it was like if you had a cottage in the middle of this park. People did. invite all your friends for the weekend and things like that. And there weren't boundaries. It wasn't a park that was, squared off and only the park is in that. It was interspersed with the rest of Island Park and the rest of the resort area. It really was a resort area. And it was easily accessible. And, even in the early days, the people loved the roller coaster. And the merry-go-round was a great place to bring kids. I grew up in a part of the country where we had 3 major amusement parks, and even we had school days where our town would have May 31st as the day we went to and the whole town would go, and you see everybody you knew, and it was just kind of fun to do that.
Jim, Island Park has really experienced somewhat of a resurgence, right? It's come sort of the unofficial center of the town now.
I think it's important to understand that the recovery, shall we say, of Island Park is a really important part of our town's history. Obviously, the 38 hurricane destroyed it. The 1938 hurricane, when a 12-foot wall of water came up the river and landed on the beach, took houses all the way across to where the golf course is. One woman was working at her house and the foundation came loose. She got up on the roof with her 2 kids, floated out into Narragansett Bay, and were picked up by the Navy. Okay, but so it obviously was damaged significantly in 1938, and it's only in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years where new restaurants have shown up, and it's begun to grow, and it's a more popular place than it was. Parking's still a problem, but and there are, it has recovered a lot. I know as far as restaurants, most of the Portsmouth restaurants are there, and it's just a really good place for people to go. So that's the current. It's coming back. So, but I think that's really an important part of our history. So anyway, it's an important era of our history. It's a very important era of the town's history. It's something that isn't explored much. It's out there at the end of the peninsula someplace, but it's a very valuable part of our town, and I think it's. I'm glad to see that it's recovering a lot from 1938, which is amazing.
Till now. Well, I'd like to thank you, Jim, for being part of this. Mark and myself, we appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
And thank everybody for watching.